So today's webinar is what we affectionately refer to as House Liaison 101. So I'm going to cover just the basic information that we wanted to make sure that House liaisons know. For the most part, that equates to some definitions. We're going to talk about the McKinney-Vento, specifically that piece of legislation and what the definitions are for homelessness that are included there. And then we'll talk a little bit about financial aid and the HEA, and then again, more definitions around continuum of care, how you access it, what that is. And then looking a little bit at data for the national picture, but then also in terms of what ICCB is hoping that you're able to provide at the end of the year. And then finally, we'll talk about how to roll out resources to your students, since that's a significant component of the responsibilities for the liaisons. Okay, so first I said we would talk about some definitions, so let's kind of get into it here. So the Higher Education Housing and Opportunities Act is the act that actually created the House liaisons. And when you look at that piece of legislation, you'll notice that there are 10 duties for the liaisons, plus a magical 11th kind of catch-all bucket, which is if there's something you as the liaison feel like is appropriate for you to be doing to help support students experiencing homelessness and students in care, you're given the power to go ahead and implement that also. You'll notice between these next couple of slides, I do have more than 10 bullets because, you know, I am a fan of plain language. So for some of your duties, I did crack them into kind of smaller pieces and parts. So for those of you who may be counting bullets, you'll notice it doesn't match 10, it's a few extra. So for me, when I look at the legislation, I always think about House Liaison as kind of these two pieces. One piece is around navigation and one piece is around subject matter expertise. So first, this slide is about navigation. So thinking about how we navigate students through the financial aid application, through various campus offices. One of the biggest parts about being the House liaison is that you're this intermediary that helps the students kind of read the academic environment and also the student services environment, but also kind of those bureaucratic pieces that often students find themselves sort of tangled up in. And then you're also the person that connects students to your local continuum of care. And that can be a challenge in some ways. We'll give you some ways to decipher that. But for sure, reaching out to your local continuum, becoming part of those meetings that they do monthly or quarterly are all ways for you to kind of start building relationships so that it's easier to do a warm handoff with students instead of just kind of cold calling somebody in your continuum trying to get somebody connected. Another component of navigation is publishing resources on the website for your institution, and that needs to include both the kinds of services you offer at your institution, but then what your local region provides in terms of support for students in care and students experiencing homelessness. Also, if you're providing housing currently through some mechanism at your institution, to make sure that you also are thinking about housing for students during breaks. And then, like I said, any of those additional services that you feel are within your purview in this role, those are all your navigation pieces. When we think about expertise, these are basically all the things you need to be able to explain to students, right? So you need to be clear on what's the definition of students who are homeless and students in care. Those are spelled out in the legislation itself. And then for students who are experiencing homelessness, the Illinois Act points to the McKinney-Vento legislation. So we're going to go through that in a second. You also need to be able to think about financial aid eligibility, and especially, I know this has been quite the year for the FAFSA, but ideally when that is all kind of settled, it should make it easier for students to be able to actually access and apply for that funding. You're also, as an area of expertise, going to be able to identify who is that continuum of care point person for you to connect to, for students to connect to. You'll be able to think about all of the different kinds of wraparound services your institution provides and your community provides, and you're going to be able to kind of match each student to those resources as appropriate. And then these next pieces are really about what we do with data and how we're looking at student metrics. So looking at students in terms of what are the services that they're receiving, and then what those services are doing in terms of impacting retention, success, graduation rates. And for ICCB, you'll want to collect that information and report on it annually. But beyond that, trying to think with your institution about what are those key performance indicators we're looking for, and how are we going to know that we're having an impact for students in care or students experiencing homelessness. And then finally, the way that the legislation really wants you to take your expertise and kind of spread the wealth is by figuring out ways to train the folks at your institution about how to identify these student populations and how to refer them for support and services. So those are basically, in a nutshell, all the moving parts of what a liaison is supposed to be doing. When we talk about McKinney-Vento, this is the piece of legislation federally that defines homelessness. And I often see this first bullet on institutional websites, right? Like if we're trying to explain to students who is covered as a student experiencing homelessness, we usually say that it's a student who lacks fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. But McKinney-Vento then goes further and kind of breaks that out, right? So like that first bullet is kind of the umbrella, and then these subsequent bullets get a little more into the nitty gritty, right? So if they're using as a nighttime residence, some kind of place that's not really designed for humans to be sleeping. So that could be a student's car, it could be an area park. McKinney-Vento also goes into abandoned buildings, bus stations, train stations, camping grounds, right? Airports, any of these places where we don't really mean for these to be used as actual human shelter. But then you'll see the next bullet is, or if you're staying at a shelter or some other kind of community program that's designed as a temporary dwelling, then that also counts as currently homeless. Or if a student is being returned to a shelter or to some other kind of residence coming out of an institutionalization situation, then that would also make you currently homeless under the McKinney-Vento law. McKinney-Vento also talks about this other category of homelessness, which is imminently homeless. So if a student is going to be homeless within the next 14 days, then they qualify as a McKinney-Vento homeless designation. So this is basically any of these ideas. So if you know that somebody is going to imminently lose the housing where they currently reside, or if they're living somewhere and not paying rent, if they don't have another residence identified as the place they'll be moving to, if they don't have the resources to secure another place. And honestly, what you really are looking for is credible evidence of those situations. So credible evidence can be an eviction notice. It can also be evidence a student provides that they don't have the funds to put down as a deposit or to continue to pay the next 14 days of rent. In McKinney-Vento, there's also this domestic violence provision. So if a student is attempting to flee a domestic violence situation, a stalking situation, sexual assault, any of those kinds of life-threatening situations at their current residence, then that also counts in McKinney-Vento as kind of this imminent homelessness, but under domestic violence. And again, I want to point out this last bullet here. It also includes unaccompanied youth who are fleeing an abusive parent or guardian. The other part of the House Act is that you're looking to care for students experiencing homelessness, but also for students in care. So the definition for students in care really comes from thinking about this piece connecting to the Department of Children and Family Services. And really, it's any youth who've aged out of the care system at 18 or older. They were formerly under care and they've now been adopted, or they've been placed into guardianship or a guardianship agreement. So those are the different categories for students in care. When we look at financial aid, the law that's being pointed to in the House bill is Higher Education Act of 1965 as currently amended. So in this piece, we're looking at really the FAFSA implications for the most part, right? And if a student can be designated an independent student. So under this act, a student can be designated as an independent student if they're an unaccompanied youth who is homeless as defined by McKinney-Vento that we just looked at, or they're unaccompanied at risk of homelessness and self-supporting. And there are different kinds of standards and language kind of connected to that. Also to think about another category of independent students is the benefit there is that they don't need to report parent information on their FAFSA. And I think for those of you from financial aid offices on this call, I believe you're kind of I was going to say knee deep, but you're probably deeper than knee deep on the FAFSA simplification. So basically, what the Simplification Act does is try to simplify FAFSA, right? To make it fewer questions and to make it a little bit easier for institutions to administer and also for students and parents to complete. I won't get into how that all planned out this year, but hopefully moving forward, it will be simplified. And one of the nice things about this as it pertains to students in care and students experiencing homelessness is that we're a little more lenient around the standard of proof. And that for the most part, if a student's self-reported answers on their dependency status seem to all be consistent, then the financial aid office doesn't necessarily have to do any additional proof digging unless something is happening in the information the student provides that the financial aid officer reads as conflicting information. And the institution can then decide what's reasonable proof. It also requires that some of these are now absolutely valid forms. So in previous iterations, these were not always widely accepted, perhaps, but now in the new iteration, when we say evidence from a local homeless liaison, from a director of a homeless services program, from the director of TRIO, all of those can actually be accepted now as documentation. So before, those were kind of optional institution by institution, and now under the simplification, the current practice now is those are all documentation forms that must be accepted instead of leaving it kind of institution to institution. Also connected to that is that the financial aid administrator at another institution who made that determination on that student being homeless or being independent, that can now carry over to the next institution. So the financial aid administrator can use that documentation from the year prior instead of having to start the whirligig kind of all over again. And part of that is because the Department of Ed was a little concerned that we were focusing a little too much on why students were presenting as homeless students instead of thinking about whether or not, like, the job is really to determine whether or not they qualify more than getting into the weeds with students about the reasons why they were becoming homeless. So that's more or less kind of where we're at currently in the changes. They were effective in this past school year, but I think where we're really going to see more use of this language is moving forward once the simplification is kind of completed. And there are a couple other places to think about financial aid. One of the pieces where we sometimes get into the weeds is around having a mailing address. And the legislation does allow for students to use the college's address as the mailing address, but it's unwise to do that without the college specifying a human being who would really be the receiver of the physical mail, and then the student would go pick it up from that office and that person. So, and the student needs to ask permission to use the college's address. They can't just write the address. So as a house liaison, that could potentially be a service that you provide to students experiencing homelessness or students in care, that you could really be the person who kind of is the receiver of the mail. There are also a ton of really great resources about financial aid and about the simplification and about how it impacts especially youth experiencing homelessness. So I put all of those links on here for you. Some of them are dear colleague letters, and some of them are from other organizations that do really deep dives into this work. So I think Schoolhouse Connection is probably one of the better known organizations that provides a lot of information. You can see I have the last two links are from that organization. I'm a fan. So I think those are some other, some of those resources are kind of like prefab printable literature that you can share with students and with staff and faculty. So I think those are kind of worth taking a look at. And then for students in care, DCFS provides a lot of post-secondary support. So these are some additional resources specifically for students in care to get scholarships for post-secondary education. Okay, so as promised, we're going to chat a little bit about the continuum of care. So back to our friends at McKinney-Vento, the most recent renewal of that legislation brought to it this idea of continuum of care. So before 2009, all of the systems were fragmented. You're still going to see some fragments, but back before the continuum of care existed, if a student was trying to get services and they stayed at this shelter and then that shelter became full and they had to go to a different shelter, they would have to complete a whole separate intake. So it was a lot of duplication of effort, especially on the part of the person trying to receive the services. The continuum of care idea basically combines multiple service systems into what ultimately will be kind of this like seamless umbrella of services for folks who are experiencing homelessness. So ideally, you make contact with the person at the continuum of care, and then that person basically does an intake with the student and then starts to kind of case manage with that student to figure out which services in that continuum would most benefit the student. You can see Illinois is a big state and there's only 19 continuum of cares. Not every continuum of care perfectly seamlessly overlaps your community college district. So some districts are entirely inside a single continuum of care. Some districts are going to be overlapping more than one continuum of care. So the best way to figure it out is to go to the HUD Exchange, which looks like this. And then you can basically type in the town where your college is situated or the town where the student in question was last housed, and then kind of work through which of these continuum of care would be your continuum of care for that student. You can then see, once you search, it'll bring up the organization's name, the contact for the particular collaboration, and then that'll get you going. Sorry, I'm looking to see if there are chat. I can see the chat has chats in it. So this to say, this is the best way to figure it out. It is still not 100% perfect. and you may need to reach out to more than one of the people listed in order to get your needs met for your student. But this is really the starting point, is going to the HUD exchange and then looking up the continuum of care for your particular region. It also occurred to me that there may be folks already at your institution who do have relationships with somebody at the continuum of care. And those could be folks that are in your TRIO office, or if you have Gear Up or Upward Bound, any of those folks may already be connected. Folks in your disability services office or in adult ed may also be connected. And each of your feeder high schools has a McKinney-Vento liaison already as part of their structure. So if you can reach out to your local high school and connect to that person, they can likely tell you who the contact is for your continuum of care. If you don't know who that person is at your high school, I put another link here that takes you to ISB's website that'll then help you figure out who is the homeless liaison director at your particular institutions. Okay. So when we're thinking about data, right? So part of what the House Liaison is doing is capturing the data about how many students and what kinds of services and what else should we be thinking about. I wanted to kind of situate you in the national picture first. One of my favorite recent documents on this particular issue comes from CESI. They're the folks that do the Community College Survey of Student Engagement. And during the pandemic, they added a module of questions about basic needs and basic needs security issues. So they looked at housing and also food insecurity, and then issued this report in 2022. One of the caveats, though, was that they think it was likely underreported because we were doing it during the pandemic. So this to say, CESI at this point continues to offer these basic needs modules. If your institution isn't yet using them, you may wish to speak to somebody in your institutional research office to see if that would be a possibility, just as a way to kind of supplement your data and to get the bigger picture about basic needs security at your campus. So these graphs are from the Mission Critical Report. I just thought it was kind of interesting to just show these couple of things. So the verbiage they use is in the last 12 months, did you ever da, 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 da. So these graphs over here on the left are looking at staying in temporary housing, is that first one with the 3% saying yes. Did you stay in a place, like you can see how this is going with the McKinney language, right? So did you stay in an outdoor location or a space not meant for human habitation, 2%. And then when we ask students about, did you stay somewhere temporarily, like a friend's home or couch, relatives location, because you had no other place to stay, the number goes from 2 or 3% up to 7%. And then when you come over here to the right, when we ask students about other kinds of measures of security, so about having to skip maybe paying particular utilities in order to make sure they had enough money for rent, like that's an indicator that housing can be in jeopardy, right? So they asked several questions, and basically after all of it looked and said, okay, really 14% of students, and this is just in community colleges, are low or very low housing security. And then when you disaggregate that data by race, you can see that there's a disparity there, where for low or very low housing security, there are several race and ethnicity groups that are kind of overrepresented in the data. So that I thought was kind of something interesting, and it would be something that your institution could also do and replicate and see if these trends also hold true at your institution. Another organization that does a lot of deep work in this space is the Hope Center out of Temple University. And they implement another similar survey, but it's all about basic needs. The CESI survey includes all kinds of other things about the students' community college experience. This survey, though, about Real College is really specifically looking at basic needs. And this survey was done with 130 two-year institutions and 72 four-year institutions. All in all, they had almost 200,000 students completing the survey. And here you can see 3 and 5 students experience some kind of basic needs insecurity. Housing insecurity affected almost half of those students. Homelessness affected 14% of those students. And here again, they found a disparity in terms of race and ethnicity, looking at specifically the Black to white gap in basic needs security and seeing a 16 percentage point difference between those two groups. So those are pieces I think are really important to look at. I also think it's interesting if you look kind of in the lower right-hand side of this graph, where it's talking about students accessing supports to help with those basic needs. And about half of the students surveyed didn't apply for any supports because they didn't know how. So again, I think that's a big part of your work as liaisons, is that navigation piece and helping students know what's available and then helping getting them connected to that. And again, the Hope Center did a lot of disaggregation of their data. So they looked at students who were involved in the foster care system, in the justice system, students who were single parents. That's all this kind of top graph. And then under that is looking at students experiencing basic needs insecurity by certain kinds of status around Pell eligibility, first generation, full-time and part-time. So here again, you can kind of see there's an impact greater on Pell students than non-Pell students, first generation versus non-first generation. And then again, over here to the right, looking at those disparities by race and ethnic identity, and also LGBTQ status and gender identity. So again, looking, and you can see that LGBTQ students have a greater impact, as do female students and as do particular racial and ethnic groups. For the data that ICCB generally asks the liaisons for, basically what they're interested in looking at is, where is your office located? As those of you who are looking to see who else is on the call, you'll see you're from all different kinds of departments at your institution. So ICCB is really trying to get a handle on where everybody is located inside of their institutions. They're also going to ask you about how you communicate about your existence and about the available supports that you provide. And then we get into the numbers part, right? So how many students were receiving services? What were the kinds of services? What were the outcomes of those services? And then using some of your existing institutional research data around your A1 report, pulling out specific head counts for the number of students experiencing homelessness and the number of students in care at your institution. And then finally, ICCB also has you write a little bit around what are the challenges you've been facing, what kinds of professional development have you completed, what kinds of things are needed. So this is the data that you'll want to be keeping track of for when you report to ICCB. So as long as we're kind of talking about services and resources, there's a lot in the literature around how the services that are provided at institutions can really help relieve stressors of homelessness, right? And some of these are the obvious ones, right? So providing advising, counseling, linkages to community resources, simple things like access to internet, and ways that we have to defray the costs of attendance that kind of go beyond Pell. So institutional scholarships or waivers, having book loan, supply loan, all of those kinds of things. And then the kinds of social supports that institutions provide through peers, faculty, staff, right? And then we often talk about developing resilience. And one of the key ways that that's done is you make choices in a somewhat controlled environment so that the consequences of your choices aren't going to be crippling. So these are different kinds of ways that really a college environment can really help to relieve the stressors of homelessness. But I was thinking, you all probably have a lot of resources at your institutions that you provide that could support students experiencing homelessness or students in care. So I wanted to just do a waterfall activity to kind of see what you all are providing and thinking about for your institutions. So here's how a waterfall works. If you haven't done one with me before, go into the chat, and in the chat, answer this question. What are the resources does your college provide that could support students experiencing homelessness or students in care? Enter it in the chat. Don't hit the enter button just yet. We're going to take a minute or so and let people kind of pile all of their ideas into the chat. And then when I say go, you'll hit enter, and then it waterfalls into the chat. So for now, just go into the chat and write about what your institution is currently providing in terms of resources that you think could really function as student supports for students experiencing homelessness or students in care. Great, you guys have some great answers, right? So basic needs funding from ECMC, counseling, financial counseling, food support, peer-to-peer advising, right? Loans, yep, maximizing Pell. Thanks, Mary. Yep, laptop and hotspot loans, great. Textbook support, gas cards, emergency student support. Food pantry, yep. Wellness specialist, great. Case manager services, hygiene kits, yep. Food gift cards. This is great. Yep, emergency funding for imminent homelessness. Yeah, bus cards, laptop loan. Great, right? A lot of really what you're doing is taking existing resources that you provide to all students and then thinking about really how to specifically market them to this group. Yeah, laptop, yes, yes. Yeah, these are great. Thank you for participating. These are the kinds of things that generally too that I think we do, right? So we talked about well, better than computer labs, you're doing actual loan pieces. We talked about counseling resources. I also think having a cafeteria and thinking about how to maximize use of the cafeteria, right? Providing that Pell or MAP application assistance, scholarships, lending libraries, a lot of you had that, transportation, you had that. Secure parking lots. Those of you who know me know that I love a good secure parking lot used as a place for students to be safe at night if they're having to use their cars as their shelter. And then kind of connecting to that, lockers and showers and laundry and that kind of thing. I do also think your library or your writing center is probably another place where you'll find students are looking for support and connection. And then things like career services too. So all of those ideas that you had, and then these pieces too. Ultimately, the best resource you all have is human capital, right? You have so many people at your institution that can help do outreach, can help build relationships, can help be kind of eyes and ears to look for signs of trauma and to help refer those students and kind of build these safe spaces for students so that it's not just you as an island doing it, but to really be thinking about your institution as this ecosystem that supports students. So now that you know all of your resources, we're going to chat just a little bit about how to roll out some of these resources. So a lot of, I'm just going to just put this out there first. I realize a lot of what I'm going to advise about information rollout is not something you can decide all by yourself that you're going to do this. I realize that I'm going to suggest it as if it's a simple thing to do, but I just want to acknowledge, I realize many of these are not simple things to do because you work at complex organizations. So when I say things like email all students, I realize that that probably is going to need to be okayed by a different group of humans who may not be on this call. But this to say, emailing all students about the resources is preferred as an opt-out design. So again, a lot of the designs I'm going to promote are things where you're going to offer them to everybody, and then students who do not need that service will opt out by not participating. It's an easier mechanism than trying to kind of pinpoint each kind of student who may be at risk of homelessness, and then you may end up missing someone. It's just a little bit easier if you just let everybody know. There are also other places where every student passes through this mechanism on their way into your institution, right? So some institutions do that via new student orientation. So providing your contact information there, providing liaison information on other kinds of mailings. So for example, billing statements. A lot of billing statements are still getting mailed out to student addresses, putting a little blurb on there about what the liaisons do and what kinds of resources you provide or how to locate you, I think is another good way. Be thinking about these pieces that are going to wide swaths of students as kind of how you can roll out some of this information. And then finally, I put looping in your faculty and ideally getting them to put some verbiage into their syllabus. Again, realizing like this is not something that you can easily do all on your own, but that it's worth starting to have conversations, if you haven't already, with some of your faculty leadership, some of your administrative leadership, and having additional verbiage added to the syllabus. Again, faculty may tell you one of two things: either their syllabus already has too much stuff in it, or the students aren't really reading it anyway. But the truth of the matter is, the more places you can put your information that students may see it, the better. So that's kind of what we're shooting for here, is like, let's really permeate the environment with your contact information so that the maximum number of people will get their eyeballs on it and then be able to find you from it. And again, our friends from Schoolhouse Connection have additional ideas and can kind of help you think those pieces through. One of the things I'm always going to talk about is the importance of using plain language. So when we talk about especially the House bill, or we talk about McKinney-Vento, that language is not really student or user friendly language, right? So when you're talking about who you are, what you do, how you came to be that contact person, figure out ways to do it that are really plain language. And for something to be good plain language, you want a student, you want the reader to be able to read it once and act on it. So you want to use just simple, readable language. And I also realize this may not align with traditional rules of style or with what your marketing department may want in terms of what lives on your website. But the truth of the matter is, students aren't necessarily entering our website from our homepage and then proceeding accordingly. You know this, like a lot of folks, when they come to your website, they go to the search box and they type in something and then they just jump to that page. So there's an argument to be made here that you can repeat yourself on more than one page if you get to have more than one page, because students may find you via search and miss your opening statement, which is on a different page. So this to say, the kind of plain language I'm advocating, it doesn't always align perfectly with the college's rules of style, but I'm okay with that. But again, I realize these are decisions where you're going to have to work for some buy-in with other folks at your institution. And again, word choice and sentence structure, I think, are also key features of plain language. And when you're thinking about the design, whether it's your web page, whether it's a single page handout, whether it's an insert that goes into an existing mailing or into the student handbook or the orientation guide, be thinking about page design in terms of making it easy to find what folks are looking for and easy to understand what they find and then act on what they find, right? If ultimately the purpose of your information is they're able to find you or they're able to find the resource, you want to make sure that this is something that's an easy thing to act on once they're able to read it. And also that most students experiencing basic needs security are not able to look at our literature in a nice, calm state. Like usually if they're looking for help, they're in a bit of a panicked state. So you also want to take that into consideration when you're crafting your language. Here again, I put a couple of links down here that'll be of use to you. If you're really interested in taking some of your documents and creating them in more of a plain language way, next week's webinar is actually going to be on plain language. We're going to have Sarah from Literacy Works Chicago do that session with you all next week. So if you want to get more into this idea about plain language and making some of our documents really easy to understand and easy to read and easy to act on for students, Sarah's session will help you tremendously with that. And then these are a couple websites where I like how they thought about how to make the information accessible to students. So the one on the left is a food pantry in Texas, and they organize theirs as questions and answers. You can also see there they use an opt-out design. So everybody at their institution is eligible to use the food pantry, and you're even eligible to create a pantry package for another person at the campus if that person is unable to get there themselves. So they do that. They also kind of normalize this idea by making it something everybody on campus can use, and then also integrating information here that invites everybody to participate either as a participant or as a donor. So I thought that was really lovely. And it is plain language, easy to read. You can act on this after a single reading. So I put that as a model for you to look at. The one over here on the right is same institution, but kind of the bigger picture, right? When they're featuring all of their care center resources, they do a mix of pictures and words. And I thought that was kind of another savvy way to approach the work, is to maybe just put pictures of what the resources are. Students can then just select the picture of the thing that they're looking for, and then it takes them to this kind of friendly Q&A page. So I just thought that was kind of a good way to think about approaching this idea of plain language, to either do it as FAQs or do it kind of as photographs. And then here are a variety of resources I thought would kind of get you going if you're new to this work. So the Real College Survey and the Community College Survey Student Engagement Report, those are those first two links. The McKinney-Vento Act, the full text with all of the definitions, is that next one. There's also a great flow chart out there by the National Center for Homeless Education. It's this decision tree as you're trying to work through if a student meets that definition of homelessness. And then, of course, the good people at ICSPS have a fantastic super strategy document about working with students who are homeless. This is partially because students experiencing homelessness and students in care are special populations for the Carl Perkins Career and Technical Education Grant. So that is also another point of connection for you at your institutions, is find your Perkins Grant administrator and have a chat about what kinds of services and what kinds of supports they're interested in integrating into that grant. So that can be another way to kind of help piece things together and provide some funding. I noticed in the chat, some of you had that kind of thing, right? For CTE students, they were getting a particular kind of support. I'm imagining that's coming through the Perkins grant for those students. And then finally, the Center for Plain Language, and like I said, our next week, Literacy Works is going to be doing a session for us on plain language, but Center for Plain Language also has some really great information and resources. So I wanted to get to your questions. Before I do, though, I'm going to jump ahead. So we do have 2 webinars upcoming. Next week, like I said, it's the Introduction to Plain Language with Sarah Glazer from Literacy Works. And then the week after that, I'll be back and doing a session with you on a strategy called nudging, which is how to use low-cost, low-touch interventions to support students. So both of those sessions were out or open currently for registration. I also, again, put the link down here at the bottom. And then I also just wanted to point out that we do have a technical assistance survey link currently live, and I'll put it in the chat while you all are thinking about questions. And that technical assistance survey, you'll answer those questions, and then I will reach out to you and provide you with some resources that address the areas where you feel like you need some support. Okay, so having said all of that, what questions do you have? What have you been finding are the easy parts and the more challenging parts? So Donna and Wally, you're new to the role. Are you new to your institution too, or just new to the role? Oh, new. Yes. Alexandra, yes. The most challenging is not having an immediate solution or temporary solution when a student is homeless. And I think you'll find, even if you're working with your continuum of care, they're having the same concern, right? That like the scope of the need and the scope of the available housing don't match. Yes, and Wally, I agree. Finding out what is available on campus can be the first hurdle, right? Especially if you're new, trying to figure out what is the scope.
Now to jump in to
Hey,
break the
Mary.
ice. Hi. And there's several Mary Greenwoods. These are all members of my team here at Wabanzi, so not a technical glitch on our end. But anyhow, I think one of the biggest challenges for us is the lack of funding, and I think I just saw that in the chat. You know, this is a unfunded mandate, and when students come in with this need, you know, it's hard for us to put cash in hand to help them achieve these needs. We can certainly connect them to community resources, but as we see in this chat, there's several that are at capacity, or there's long waiting lists for resources, or people, you know, are just not comfortable with the idea of going to a shelter. And so, really, just to have some funding support behind this could really help with this work.
Yeah, I agree, Mary. There's actually a grant out now, a national grant that Mackenzie, I'm gonna put you on the spot temporarily, that Mackenzie and her team are looking at to try to figure out if it's something we could approach from the state level, or if it's something for more institutional level, or a consortium of institutions that would be able to be a funding source that could help alleviate some of these things. It doesn't do things like create housing, but you could potentially use those funds to help, especially a student who needed funds to prevent eviction, or trying to kind of figure out ways to keep students out of the continuum of care system in some regards, right? Like if we can really prevent them from becoming homeless in the first place, that's a great strategy. So this to say, Mac, I don't know if you have anything concrete to say about that grant idea. I know we're just kicking it around, but
No, but Dina and I have it on our list, our growing list of topics to discuss and to look for additional monies to help assist the students and the universities, the colleges.
and I think that grant's due the beginning of August, so it would be like a little bit of a summer hustle project to kind of pull that together. But that could maybe be something. Yes, Donna, I see your question or your comment in here about when you have a student who's homeless and you ask financial aid staff, sometimes you get different answers. Wally, I'm going to find the name of the grant and um, I'll send it. But Donna, one of the things I think, Mary, I'm gonna sort of put you back on the spot, Mary. One of the things that Wabanzi has done is to work up kind of a standard operating procedure document. And I think that's a great best practice for us to work on kind of expanding across the institutions. If we're able to kind of come together as an institution and say, okay, when this question comes, this is our institutional answer, that's going to get you a lot further than like, we can't have it where it's like an octopus and every arm is doing its own thing.
No, Patty, that's fine. And I'll put my contact information in the chat if people want to reach out, just to look at our SOP. I will say it is a living document. We look at it periodically to change, but happy to share it out for others to look at.
Thank you, Mary. You're always so gracious. Yeah. Does anyone have ideas for Wally about what's the quickest way to figure out what is available on your campus? I would imagine, Wally, does your institution have a dean of student services or a wellness center? I mean, like, it's hard because each college is organized a little bit differently, but
I am the wellness center.
okay, good progress.
And who is over me is our counselor, who's also new, got hired at the same time. Our dean of services seems to be more very administrative oriented and very overwhelmed with a lot of things. I think I just need to start calling individual people and asking them, because I thought at first I had a handle on what is here, but the longer I'm here, the more I hear little things that I didn't know were here. So,
well, I wonder too, do you have a grant office at your institution?
not a grant office so much. I know I was over at Workforce yesterday, and they have a person that pretty much works exclusively on grants. So maybe that would be the closest we have.
Yeah, sometimes that's, again, each institution is a little bit different, but sometimes the folks who work on the grants have been writing grants to underwrite certain kinds of services, so they could tell you, here's, you know what I mean, here's what we've got. Or Mary in the comments too said, finding counselors. I realize like your counselor above you is new. If there's another one who's not new, like
He's the only one.
that
Okay.
could be someone. What about, do you have department chairs or faculty, sometimes faculty coordinators, program coordinator, like some faculty member who's been there a while and is in a leadership-ish role?
I'm thinking of someone. I should just sit down and have a meeting with them and pick their brain. So thank you. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Are you serving in the capacity of the other liaison roles as well? The benefits navigator?
Yeah, that's me.
Okay, so you're all of them?
Yeah. Oh, and this role was not here before. So I'm I'm creating the job. So it's, but I mean, I've helped students since I've been here, but the more I listen to y'all about getting the information out there and everything, the more I realize I'm only doing like a quarter of the job I need to do, So, because I think there's a lot more need out there that's not reaching me. So,
yeah. Well, and I think too, it's most of you have other hats that you're wearing at your institutions too, right? So for many of you, this is a piece that got kind of added on to existing responsibilities. So I think there are a lot of you that are kind of struggling with, you work 40 hours a week, you have to fit these pieces in. You can't really put 40 pounds of potatoes in a 10-pound sack and think that's going to work out. So that's why so I kind of got fixated on this thing about nudging, mostly because I think it's something you could kind of build into, if your institution uses Outlook, you could basically create these emails, set them up in Outlook, and then tell Outlook to do the sending for you. So I was trying to kind of find something that would be like a low touch, easy way to kind of send out information and move students along, but we'll see. We'll see. Come back in 2 weeks and we'll see if you think I'm right about that. And for sure, next week, come back for the session on plain language. I think it'll help with some of these ideas in terms of just how do we communicate what it is that we are doing, and what are we offering, and how do we talk about the work. So, but thank you. I realize we're at time, so I don't want to keep you late, but thank you all for coming today and for participating. And Mary, for sharing your email with everybody.